Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. We are going to make another long journey to ancient times and explore 1,000 years of history tonight. I'm going to tell you the story of Byzantium. Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire, is a bridge between antiquity and modern times because it began as a continuation of the Roman Empire in the East after the Western Roman Empire had collapsed. But apart from keeping alive the Roman and Greek legacy, it developed a story of its own for centuries, one made of disasters and reconquests, prestige, intellectual and artistic development. To the Europeans, the Arabs, the Turks, the Persians, Byzantium was a model for centuries until its final decline during the Middle Ages. It was at the center of religious conflicts, too, that led to the separation of the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. It left extraordinary architecture. It directly influenced many countries, such as the Ottoman Empire and Russia. And it was at war almost constantly for centuries, until it died of exhaustion at the dawn of modern times. So we're going to detail all of this and more in our story tonight. If you are interested in the history of the Roman Empire before Byzantium, I have a two-part overview of the Roman Republic and Empire waiting for you. But this story can be listened to it independently. You don't need the first two parts to understand everything. I will compile the three parts together soon for you to have a seamless story of ancient Rome over 2,000 years. From the foundation of Rome to the fall of Constantinople. But first, I would like to take a few moments of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more of it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. Our least expensive tier is $3.50 per month, but it doesn't mean you will get less. We let people contribute what they wish or can, and everyone gets everything that is on our page. Because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. You will gain access to 20 exclusive episodes offered only in Patreon, and we add a new one every month. And you can listen to and download all the episodes with and without background sounds. And as a token of gratitude, we offer advance releases to our patrons. We have added a link to Patreon, as well as links to different streaming options, which may be better suited for you. You will find these links in the description of the episode. But before we begin, let's take a moment together to prepare for our journey ahead. If you'd like, gently close your eyes and let your daily concerns drift away. Find a position that feels natural and cozy. Perhaps make small adjustments until you're perfectly comfortable. Now draw in a deep, nourishing breath, and as you release it, do it softly. Notice how your body responds. Feel the warmth flowing from your neck down through your shoulders, melting away any tension. Let your facial muscles become soft, your jaw loose, your fingers naturally open, and your legs completely at ease. As you settle into this peaceful state, my voice will be your gentle companion as we begin our exploration together. For 1,000 years, the city of Rome expanded its power, first as a kingdom in Italy, then as the center of a republic, projecting its influence around the Mediterranean Sea, and finally as the capital of an empire that was larger and more powerful than any other before. The rise of Rome was never a steady ride. It came with countless battles, victories and defeats, political crises, civil wars, troubles and revolts. But for centuries, Rome overcame everything, and it reached the peak of its expansion and prosperity in the 2nd century AD. But no state is immortal, and starting in the 3rd century AD, the instability due to the size of the empire, internal power struggles, and the threats accumulating at its borders put the empire in a dangerous situation. Expansion stopped, and Rome was hit again by the kind of civil wars it had avoided for generations. The empire splintered into rival factions and later was gathered back into one, though not without surrendering pieces of its territory. To the north, Germanic tribes pressed against the Balkans, Italy, and Gaul. To the east stood the Persians, and soon would arrive another formidable enemy, the Huns and their chief, Attila. In the 4th century, the old model that centralized power in Rome, thousands of miles away from the front lines and the most remote provinces, looked unsustainable. Rome was still a great military and cultural power that had Romanized faraway provinces, but some of them retained specificities, especially in the East, the Greek world, the Middle East, Egypt. They had been part of the Roman world for centuries already, but they didn't speak the language, and they had kept specific cultures. To them, Rome was a faraway capital that looked less and less able to maintain peace. Starting by the end of the 3rd century, under Emperor Diocletian, and for a big part of the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman Empire changed its administration, and it split into 2 entities that would be able to better organize their defense and guarantee stability. A western and eastern half that were still part of the same empire and actively collaborating, but in practice, interestingly, had their own administration, armies, and resources. They were not constantly separated. Some emperors reunified the 2 halves, but the last one to reign the entire Roman Empire was Theodosius at the end of the 4th century. After him, the 2 halves never reunited. The Western Roman Empire logically kept Rome as its capital until the last decades of its existence, when it was moved north to Ravenna. The Eastern Roman Empire needed a new capital. It could have been Alexandria, a major city of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea back then, or another major city such as Antioch or Athens. But the site of the new capital, chosen by an emperor called Constantine I, was further north, at a very strategic location where Europe and the Middle East and the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea are separated by a narrow strait. This strait is called Bosphorus, and there was a city called Byzantium, founded by the Greeks several centuries earlier. The origins of Byzantium get lost in legends, but it existed by the middle of the first millennium BC, when it was taken by the Persian Empire. Then at the end of the 5th century BC, it was captured by Sparta, when Sparta was at war with Athens. The Spartans were trying to cut grain supplies from the Black Sea to reach their enemy. Centuries later, it was besieged and captured by Romans, who rebuilt it, and Byzantium remained a Roman city, populated mainly by Greek-speaking inhabitants, until Constantine turned it into a new capital. The city was entirely rebuilt in the 4th century on a monumental scale, partly modeled after Rome itself. No efforts were spared to make Byzantium worthy of the Roman Empire. The city retained its name of Byzantium, but was also called Constantinople, Constantine's city after the emperor's death, and also New Rome. Nowadays, it is Istanbul, the largest city in Turkey, and many remains of the Roman period can still be seen there, but we will talk about that later. The location of Byzantium, Constantinople, and later Istanbul always was one of the bases of its prosperity. Any trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea had to go through the strait and could be taxed for money or barred from passing for political influence, turning Constantinople into a prosperous trade node and also a valuable military base for centuries. The two halves of the empire were not as equal as one might think when looking at a map. They were similar in size, but the western half was somewhat weaker for two reasons. The first reason is that it had less economic resources. Italy was still prosperous and would have probably had the highest equivalent of a GDP per capita if there had been such data back then. Gaul also had an important population like Italy, but it had been very affected by internal crises and civil wars in the 3rd century, and it had never recovered from them. And out of these two provinces, the other regions were scarcely populated and remained devastated by internal troubles. North Africa, Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula, Great Britain, a part of the Balkans. In total, all of these provinces had barely a few million inhabitants, and they could not defend themselves without legions sent from Italy. So at this point in Roman history, regions that had contributed to the empire's prosperity a few centuries before were now more as much a burden as an asset for the Western Roman Empire. And the second and main weakness of the western half was that it was more severely threatened by invaders. The main danger for Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries were the waves of invaders coming from Asia and Eastern Europe, Germanic tribes. There were many of them, and the Huns under Attila. The Eastern Roman Empire, in comparison, was spared a direct confrontation with most of these invaders because it could negotiate or manage to repel them, whereas they ended up overwhelming the Western Empire. So Rome had to leave Britain, then abandon entire provinces behind its frontiers to tribes that established their own kingdoms on its land. And finally, it disappeared completely. The generally agreed date for the end of the Western Roman Empire is 476 AD, the end of the 5th century. But technically, this was the end of an administrative entity of the Roman Empire, an entity that happened to contain its historical heart, the city where everything came from. But by the end of the 5th century, when this happened, the eastern half was still alive and not in such a bad situation. The Eastern Roman Empire had greater resources. Egypt was a strategic province that could provide manpower and export grain. It was a breadbasket. Greece, Syria, Anatolia's Turkey nowadays, this peninsula between the Black Sea to the north and the Mediterranean Sea to the south. So these were relatively rich regions, and they hadn't been that damaged in the past 2 centuries. They still had infrastructures, such as roads, a functioning administration that could collect taxes. They had urban centers. So when the Western Empire was crumbling in the 5th century, the Eastern Empire could hire mercenaries to defend itself, or even pay invaders to stay away and trade with them to calm them down. This is what Emperor Theodosius II did with the Huns, for example. He gave them subsidies so that they did not attack his territories in the Balkans, and instead they diverted their attention to the Western Empire. The beginning of the Byzantine Empire can be dated to the final fall of the Western Empire, but calling this state Byzantium or Byzantine Empire as we do today would have sounded really strange to its inhabitants back then, especially in the 5th and 6th centuries. They were just the Roman Empire, continuing after the unfortunate loss of the western half and of the cradle of their civilization, Rome. They called themselves Romans, and so did their neighbors. It is only much later, during the Middle Ages, that the name was changed. There were periods of expansion and retreat in the long existence of Byzantium, but the decades following the fall of Italy were a period of success, during which the Eastern Empire tried to reconquer what had been lost in the West, and for a part it succeeded. This happened under the Emperor Justinian I, who assumed the throne in 527 AD, 50 years after the disappearance of the Western Empire. Apart from Germanic peoples and the Huns, another major threat to the empire at that time was the Persians, the Sassanids. It is a completely different story that I will probably tell you another time in the future. But Persia, Iran, had several ancient empires. The earliest and the largest, the Achaemenid Empire, dominated the Middle East until it was conquered and destroyed by the armies of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, his great empire unraveled, and in its place, a new force emerged in Iran, the Parthian Empire. They waged long and difficult wars against Rome, pressing it hard, though Rome eventually learned how to contain their advance. However, it was too far for the Romans to ever come near its center, and in the 3rd century, a new power, the Sasanian Empire, named after the house of Sasan, replaced it. It lasted until the 17th century, and it was Byzantium's archenemy for 300 years. We'll see later how the Sassanids threatened the very existence of Byzantium at one point. The Sasanian Empire is also called the Neo-Persian Empire, and it was the last state in Iran until the Muslim conquest. The Sasanian Empire was multicultural, but in those pre-Islamic times, its main religion was Zoroastrianism, a very ancient religion that has lost much of its influence nowadays, but it still has a few tens of thousands of followers in Iran and around the world. A major concern for Emperor Justinian at the beginning of the 5th century was to secure his eastern frontiers with the Sassanids, and he negotiated peace with them against the tribute which allowed him to divert his forces to the west. The payments of tributes to the Huns and later to the Sassanids reflects the difficulties of the Eastern Roman Empire at the time, even though they were in a much better situation than the West. They were desperate for peace and for maintaining the unity of what they had, but it also reflects the wealth of the Eastern Roman Empire, and Justinian's reign was successful militarily, in the sense that he managed to reconquer parts of the Western Roman Empire. At the time, various peoples had settled in the West. After overwhelming the ancient Roman provinces, there were Angles and Saxons in Britain, the Visigoths and Suebi in Spain, the Franks, the Burgundies, the Visigoths in France, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Vandals in North Africa. They all mixed with the locals, participating in the melting pot from which medieval kingdoms would emerge centuries later. But for the moment, they had formed independent states with moving frontiers, and the wave of invaders had started to slow down. The context looked more favorable for an attempt to reconquer Western provinces and try to restore the Roman Empire as it once was, or at least part of it. Justinian's conquests began in 533 AD, and with his eastern frontier now stabilized, he could send his best general, Belisarius, to the west. Belisarius is maybe the last glorious Roman general. He may not be as famous as Scipio, also pronounced Scipio, or Caesar, but he could be because he was almost systematically victorious, including when odds were against him, and he led Byzantine armies to victory in North Africa, first against the Vandals. They had established their capital at Carthage, modern Tunisia, a century before, and he reconquered the province for Byzantium. Then he reconquered a big part of Italy, including Rome and the Ravenna, to the extreme west of the Mediterranean Sea. Justinian could also annex the south of Spain. By the middle of the 6th century, Byzantium had not only been able to survive, it had expanded and could hope to recreate the Roman Empire, all the more that war had resumed against the Sassanids in the east, and Justinian's armies had been victorious. Justinian is not only remembered for his conquest or reconquest, he also ordered Roman law to be updated, and he favored Christianization of the population. Religion, Christianity, is a major aspect of the Byzantine culture, and I'll come back to this in a bit. But at the time of the separation of the Roman Empire into two entities, Christianity was on the rise, but still competing with multiple ancient beliefs. The Emperor Diocletian, who initiated this separation into Western and Eastern Roman empires, was a fierce pagan. He was very attached to traditional Roman religion, but his successors were more and more Christianized in the 4th and 5th centuries, and Christianity became the official religion of the empire. But the rise of Christianity was a process over several centuries, not a quick radical change. By the 6th century, when Justinian reigned, the Eastern Roman Empire had multiple religions, and the traditional Greco-Roman culture was still quite influential. Increasingly, the power of Byzantine emperors became not only secular but also spiritual. They would be crowned by religious authorities, and they would go on a mission to Christianize, sometimes by force. The importance of Christianity from the early period of Byzantium as an independent state is well reflected in the construction of maybe the antiquity's last marble, or the first one of the Middle Ages, the Church of Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. This monument, which still stands today, 15 centuries later, was the world's largest building for centuries, and it is famous for its massive dome, which illustrates the capabilities of Byzantine architects. And they had taken in centuries of Greek and Roman engineering and architectural knowledge. It was a cathedral at the time of the Byzantine Empire. Then it became an imperial mosque under the Ottomans, and nowadays it is a museum. The construction took 5 years on the site of a previous church that had been destroyed, and for the most part, Hagia Sophia is made of bricks and mortar joints, an equivalent to concrete. The Romans used concrete in architecture. A spectacular and even older remain of it is the Roman Pantheon in Rome, that never had such a large and high dome being built before. They really tested the limits of what was possible, and the risk that the dome collapsed at some point was real. Actually, the first dome collapsed 20 years later after construction due to an earthquake. It was rebuilt and it collapsed again partially a few years later. But it was rebuilt immediately in the 6th century, and since then, 15 centuries later, it is still in place. The interior was decorated with mosaics and marble pillars that marveled visitors for centuries. The dome is 55 meters, about 180 feet above floor, and it is more than 100 feet wide. The architecture was very influential within the Byzantine Empire. Later, in countries where the Christian Orthodox faith had spread, and also in Muslim countries, traditional Turkish mosques, in particular, also adopted this intricate structure with successive domes. When Constantinople fell to the Turks and became the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Hagia Sophia was turned into a mosque. It may surprise us today, but this was common practice in antiquity or the Middle Ages. Many Christian churches were actually temples from earlier religions that had been repurposed. The Ottomans admired the building and did not remove the mural decorations. They just covered them with plaster, and they added minarets to the building, giving it its current appearance. Apart from its religious and historical significance, Hagia Sophia is a landmark in the history of architecture. It is the epitome of Byzantine architecture, and it incorporated techniques from the Greco-Roman antiquity: concrete, vaults, buttresses, and interestingly, flying buttresses. That is to say, structures that collect and guide the weight to the ground, supporting a big structure. So flying buttresses were added to Hagia Sophia before they became one of the pillars of the Gothic architecture in Western Europe. So, as Christianity became the only official religion, and most of the western provinces of the Roman Empire were lost, the Eastern Roman Empire diverged increasingly in the 6th and 7th centuries from exclusively Roman culture and traditions. The Greek language was more widespread than Latin, and many regions of the Byzantium had a specific cultural legacy from before Roman times. Of course, there was Greece, but also Egypt, Syria, Anatolia. The Roman legacy cannot be underestimated, but it was just one aspect of Byzantine culture. And Greek finally replaced Latin, turning Byzantium into the new incarnation of Greek culture for the following centuries. It may be surprising sometimes how much Greece gets mentioned in antiquity, in ancient history, or when people talk about the origins of Western culture, ultimately for such a small country. It is small nowadays, of course, but even in antiquity, with the exception of a short period when Alexander the Great had created an empire, Greece was never a large empire or even a unified kingdom. More than anything, Greece here must be understood as a cultural area, as a civilization. Its heart was almost entirely within the frontiers of modern Greece, and a little bit in Turkey too. But from this small area, Greece projected its culture for centuries through colonies all around the Mediterranean Sea during its classical period, through its contacts with many ancient civilizations that took in aspects of Greek culture or Greek knowledge, from the Phoenicians to the Etruscans, then through the conquest of Alexander that left several Greek dynasties in the Middle East, and after that, Rome also preserved and spread Greek culture, and Byzantium became another iteration, a new face of Greek culture. This package of concepts, science, artistic principles, architecture, engineering, philosophy, all these evolved along the centuries. So there is not one Greek culture set in stone, but under various forms, the Greek-speaking world remained influential in the West, almost until the end of Byzantium. So these are almost 2,000 years of influencing cultures around the Mediterranean Sea, from Western Europe to Russia, and in the Middle East too. This is why Greece is a cradle of civilization. Not so much in a geographical sense, but in a cultural, mental sense, definitely is. And this is one major characteristic of Byzantine culture. Now that the Western Latinized provinces were gone, the Greek language took over, and Byzantium allowed centers of intellectual, artistic, scientific production to endure in Greece, in the Balkans, and in Anatolia for centuries after the fall of Rome. So, let's resume the course of events. After the 6th century, which saw Byzantium resisting multiple threats at its frontiers and expanding, the following period was far less brilliant. The 7th century was disastrous for Byzantium. It started with renewed war against the Sassanids, who pushed far to the west, taking major cities in Asia Minor, like Damascus and Jerusalem, and also briefly occupied Egypt. A new emperor, Heraclius. I am going to spare us the names of most emperors, because there were dozens along Byzantine history, and several dynasties too. And I will just mention a few of them. So Heraclius counterattacked, and the main Sassanid force was destroyed. But this war left Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire completely exhausted, just as a new threat that no one had seen coming was emerging from the south, the Arabs. In just a few years, the first wave of Arab conquest overwhelmed the Middle East and North Africa, and the first two victims were the Sassanids. They finally disappeared. By the middle of the 7th century, and this is when the Islamization of Iran began, and the Byzantine Empire, which was reduced to a fraction of what it was a few decades before. It lost Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and never recovered them. At the same time, it had to face attacks from the Slavs in the Balkans and raids in Anatolia. There were underground cities in Cappadocia, a region of Anatolia. It was typically during this period when these giant shelters were enlarged to receive thousands of people, because at the time, regular raids and invasions were a fact of life in this region. The Arabs even temporarily besieged Constantinople, but they were repulsed. The frontiers shrank, and internally Byzantium was in complete decay due to raids and the constant threat of invasions in much of its territory. People abandoned cities because they were targets. Trade collapsed, and what had happened centuries earlier in the Western Roman Empire seemed to happen again. A total decay and disorganization that could have announced the end for Byzantium. In a century, it lost 3/4 of its territory and was reduced to Anatolia and fragments of the Balkans in Italy. Historians credit a military reorganization that finally managed to stabilize the frontiers for the survival of Byzantium after such a setback. At this point, hopes of reconquering the Roman Empire had vanished completely, and the city of Constantinople itself had declined enormously. At the peak in the 6th century, it is estimated that it had 500,000 inhabitants, which made it by far the biggest city in the Mediterranean world at this time. It was not as much as Rome at its peak. Rome could have had close to 1,000,000, but for ancient and medieval cities, such a size was very unusual. It required food imports from relatively far, infrastructures that few cities could afford, so only the capital or main city of a large state could have reached such a size. But by then, by the end of the 7th century, Constantinople had lost most of its inhabitants and was reduced to something between 40,000 to 70,000. After the Arab siege, it seemed that 300 years after the end of the Western Roman Empire, its eastern counterpart was now going to know the same fate, putting an end to the Roman saga. But it didn't happen, and Byzantium managed to reverse the situation and even restore its great power status, which was absolutely spectacular. So what happened? In the 8th century, Byzantium was on the defensive against the Arabs in the south and all the neighbors in the Balkans, especially the Bulgars. But its army remained a force to be reckoned with. It had inherited the ancient Roman military traditions. Byzantium remained relatively wealthy too, and could hire mercenaries throughout the centuries. People from many different origins, including even Vikings, who came from the north through what is Russia and Ukraine today, served the emperors of Byzantium, and the empire had the numbers. Greece, the south of Italy, the west of Anatolia were still densely populated regions. In the early Middle Ages, West European armies consisted of just a few thousand men at best. Even later in the Middle Ages, for example, if you look at the main battles of the 100 Years' War, they were fought by very small armies in comparison with the large battles of antiquity. At the same time, Byzantium could field tens of thousands of men, well equipped, disciplined, and for some of them motivated by the belief that they were defending their faith. So once the initial push of Arab conquest started to slow down, and then with the Caliphate, which was unified, began to break down into multiple states, a sort of military balance against the Arabs appeared. One reason why Byzantium could field so many soldiers and project power came from its administration and political structure. It was not a feudal state like in Europe, where rulers had their power checked by feudal lords under them. Byzantium had retained the ancient organization in provinces like the Roman Empire. The administrative divisions that could organize their own defenses were called themes. Byzantium kept its power closely gathered at the center. This could bring periods of unrest, but it also placed immense resources in the hands of the state and the emperors who guided it. The equipment was also top quality, and the fleet was the most powerful in the Mediterranean Sea until the rise of Venice. Byzantium had a very efficient secret weapon called Greek fire, which was the ancestor of flamethrowers, and it gave them several key victories, including when the capital was besieged by the Arabs. It consisted of a combustible compound, it is unclear which one, that could continue burning while floating on water. It was invented in the 7th century, and for greater effect, they developed pressurized nozzles that could project the liquid onto the enemy. Technologically, Byzantium was very advanced, and like centuries before in the Roman Empire, they had kept this idea, this concept that technical progress, technology, could be used to their advantage. But the 8th and 9th centuries were also a period of religious conflicts internally and in relations with the rest of Christendom. The biggest controversy of this period was about the status of images in religion and the movement called iconoclasm. There were conflicting interpretations of the scriptures about images. This is a question that was around since antiquity in the Middle East. And Judaism, Christianity, Islam, that all appeared in this part of the world, had faced it at some point. Some considered that images, the depiction of people or even animals, should be banned in a religious context because they are prohibited by sacred texts, and they are an insult to the Creator. It is not man's place to represent living creatures and compete with God in doing so. It may sound a bit extreme to us, but it is maybe because we are surrounded by so many images nowadays that their significance, their power goes unnoticed. Their proliferation reduces the importance we give to them in a sense, but this is a modern thing. Until modern times, images in the form of paintings or sculptures were very uncommon, and they were charged with a lot of power. The representation of something was not that separate from the thing in their minds. In the Middle Eastern tradition, even naming things and saying the name of a creature or god were not to be taken lightly. The name and the thing are not separate, and you summon what you name when you speak or when you write. Maybe something of this keeps existing under a very subdued form nowadays, when we won't dare to say something as if it could magically make it happen or appear. And on top of this, another factor that made images suspicious to monotheist religions was always the risk that the adoration would get diverted to idols, to the image itself, and no longer to God. Now, contrary to Islam, which solved the problem by prohibiting religious images, and this taboo has always been almost universally respected in Muslim countries, Christianity was always more permissive. It embraced images as a way to help believers get closer to the object of their adoration, and also as an educative tool. At a time when most people were illiterate, they couldn't read, paintings and sculptures on religious buildings were a way of helping people, of telling them what faith was about, some sort of writing system for the masses that couldn't read. And the Roman Catholic Church, as well as the Orthodox Church, have developed a very rich iconography along the centuries. But it took centuries to close this debate in Christianity, and it resurfaced in the 8th and 9th centuries in Byzantium, with 2 episodes of iconoclasm, literally the war, the fight on images when emperors forbade religious images and people using or producing them could be punished for heresy. It never turned into a full-blown civil war, but people died because of this, and it maintained a state of tension for decades. But religious controversies were not just internal, and they also concerned the whole Christendom, finally leading to one of the most important events and setbacks in the history of Christianity, the East-West Schism that separated the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the 11th century, 1,000 years ago. Christianity grew mainly within the frontiers of the Roman Empire during its first centuries, and this is why Rome became so important for this religion. There were Christians in Rome from the first century, but the scriptures don't tell us anything about how the church should be organized. The way it evolved as an institution is the product of centuries of history. When Roman emperors converted to Christianity, they reorganized the new official religion in a way that also reflected the reality of the Roman Empire as it was at the time. And the collapse of the Western Roman Empire made it even more complicated. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian I, the one who reconquered parts of the Western Empire, we talked about him at the beginning, formulated a church organization called the Pentarchy, in which the Christian church was governed by the 5 heads of major episcopacies: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. At the time, all 5 were within the frontiers of his empire, 4 in the east and 1, Rome, in the west. In the following centuries, this concept was generally accepted by the Byzantine Empire, but not in the west, after Rome escaped again from the control of Byzantium. The Pentarchy did not cover all churches either. The ones that developed outside the Roman Empire was seen as heretical and rejected. For example, the Church of the East, also called the Persian Church or Nestorian Church. By the way, this Nestorian Church is often overlooked in the West, partly because it never became part of the major modern Christian traditions, and partly because its history unfolded far beyond the Roman and European world that Western narratives usually follow. But in the Middle Ages, from the 9th to the 14th centuries, it spread from Syria to India as a minority religion. It influenced and converted many Mongols when they arrived in this part of the world. And it even established a presence in China, completely out of the sphere of influence of Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Nowadays, the various branches of the Nestorian Church, because it had breakups, have less than 1 million followers, so it is marginal. But it wasn't always the case. So returning to the church organization, this pentarchy was defended by Byzantine emperors, but rejected in the West. And with the massive conversion of Western Europe in the first millennium, and the appearance of Christian kingdoms all over the continent, following a church centered on Rome, the influence of Rome grew again, and the bishops of Rome, the popes, reclaimed universal jurisdiction, the lead of the entire Christendom. In the Byzantine Empire, people saw things differently. The importance of Rome was acknowledged, but not as the sole seat making decisions for all Christians. Of course, the motivations were not purely theological or spiritual. Rome was now out of reach of Roman emperors, whereas Constantinople was their capital. The concept of pentarchy dissipated in the 7th century when Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch fell to the Arabs. But the idea that power in the church didn't have to be centralized did not. So for centuries, the relationships between Byzantium and the popes in Rome were complicated and sometimes conflictual. On top of this, there were theological controversies about complex points of doctrine. For example, about the doctrine of the Trinity, whether or not it should be said that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, for example. There were also various points of disagreement about rituals that appeared along the centuries, and a linguistic barrier too. The Western Church used Latin, and the Eastern one Greek. And after centuries, the sum of tensions, geographical, doctrinal, linguistic, political, led to a schism in 1054. The two sides broke up. Rome maintained its claim to universal jurisdiction, and Byzantium claimed its autonomy from it. This is a moment when the historical Christianity that had initially developed within the Roman Empire split into two branches, the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. They remain separated today in their organizations and on points of doctrine and rituals. In the following decades, there was a scramble in Eastern Europe between the two to convert people to Christianity. This is why the majority of the population in the Balkans, in Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, follow the Orthodox Church, and so do Russia and Ukraine, whereas Rome converted first other Central European countries like Poland and Hungary. This schism also took place during a period of resurgence of Byzantium because, as I mentioned earlier, the empire managed to reverse its fate and restore a large part of its influence from the 9th century. This became possible thanks to an economic improvement. Trade grew again, a stabilization of frontiers, a weakening of Byzantium's neighbors, too, in the end, to a period of internal trouble, especially with iconoclasm receding in the 9th century. A new dynasty coming from Macedonia, from Greece, was now in power, and with the situation stabilized internally, emperors began to plan for wars of reconquest against the Muslims and the Bulgarians in the Balkans. The effort to reconquer lost lands was uneven, especially in the wars against the Arabs. But it did strengthen Byzantine control in Italy and across parts of the Mediterranean, such as Crete. They even launched expeditions towards Egypt, though the region itself was never reclaimed. Most of the gains were in the east, against the Abbasid Caliphate that was weakened in the 9th century, and after a series of wars and periods of peace, Bulgaria was reincorporated within the empire, and at the turn of the millennium, under Emperor Basil II, Byzantium stretched again from Italy to the Caucasus, including a large part of the Balkans. Constantinople flourished again. Its population almost came back to its levels of the 6th century at around 400,000. At this point, the prestige of Byzantium in the known world was that of a great power again, and by far the most powerful, the most prestigious Christian kingdom. During this resurgence, architecture and art flourished again. Painting, mosaics, churches. A lot of remains in the Balkans and Turkey from this period show the wealth and refinement of Byzantium in its society. But as in the 7th century, Byzantium was about to be the victim again of new external threats. Starting in the 11th century, the Normans invaded the south of Italy. The Normans were an ethnic group that resulted from the installation of Norse Vikings in a region called Normandy in the northwest of France, where they mixed with indigenous Franks and Gallo-Romans. Their installation dated back to the 9th century, and Normandy turned into a duchy, part of the Kingdom of France. They converted to Catholicism, and they played an important role in medieval Europe. In the 11th century, they invaded England under the Duke William the Conqueror. But at the same time, Norman adventurers sailed to Sicily, the island south of Italy. They expelled the Arabs and they created a kingdom in Sicily. They also briefly invaded southern Italy, and this is how Byzantium lost its influence there. Even later, during the Crusades, the Normans kept playing a prominent role in the creation of Crusader states in the Levant. We'll talk about that in a minute. The loss of Italy was certainly a blow, But perhaps the greatest disaster for Byzantium came in the Middle East and Asia Minor. From the east and northeast, a new people, the Turks, began probing the Byzantine frontier in Anatolia in the 11th century. Earlier Muslim Arab conquests had already taken much of the Levant, Syria, and Egypt in the 7th and 8th centuries. The Turkish Muslim powers, beginning with the Seljuks in the 11th and 12th centuries, struck deep in Anatolia and eventually occupied the empire's traditional heartland there, territory that Byzantium never fully recovered. And from there the path was opened for further loss of the eastern provinces. It is in this context that the First Crusade happened at the end of the 11th century, 40 years after the religious schism. Byzantium was now unable to repel the Turks, and its diplomacy to the west, to Rome especially, became much friendlier. The Pope also saw the advantages of supporting Byzantium. It could allow to put maybe an end to the religious breach that reduced his authority and reunite Christians. It could unify Western Europe, and obviously there was the motivation of putting holy sites in the Middle East into Christian hands again, 5 centuries after they had fallen to the Muslims. It is in this context that Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, and he received an overwhelming response in Europe from Germany, Italy, France, and England. Thousands of knights and armed pilgrims traveled eastwards. They crossed Byzantine territory and received guides when they reached Constantinople. Byzantium recovered a number of important cities and islands thanks to the First Crusade, but the Crusaders also took the opportunity to create their own independent kingdoms in the Levant. In the 12th century, Byzantium collaborated with these Latin states in the Levant and tried to be their overlord, even though its dominion was more nominal than real. But the Turks were now on the defensive and occupied only the east of Anatolia, so that the Byzantine Empire benefited from a period of respite, its last period of prosperity, because the 13th century would be disastrous. The first 3 crusades had benefited Byzantium by providing large armies eager to attack its enemies. There had been problems, especially with the Normans who participated in them and were not inclined to pledge allegiance to Constantinople. But it had eased the pressure on Byzantium. The Fourth Crusade would be catastrophic. It was called by the Pope to target Egypt, which had become the center of Muslim power in the Levant. The Crusader army gathered in Venice in 1202, but it was smaller than expected. The Venetians had agreed to safely transport the Crusaders on their power fleet against payment. But there were not sufficient funds to pay them, and also Venice had very strong commercial ties to Egypt and was not inclined to help attack it. A pretender to the throne of Byzantium offered to pay the Venetians and reward the Crusaders if they helped him seize the throne of Constantinople. And this is why the Venetian fleet sailed to Constantinople instead of Egypt. Once there, after months of intrigues and learning that their patron had been murdered, the Venetians and the Crusaders took the city and looted it. Many icons, relics, and other objects disappeared and later resurfaced in Europe, many of them in Venice. The throne now stood vacant, and a council of Crusaders and Venetians chose a new emperor, Baldwin of Flanders, while dividing most of the Byzantine lands among themselves. For 6 years, the situation remained confusing. Greece and Anatolia had exploded into principalities, and the resurgence of the Bulgarian kingdom and Hungary meant that the rest of the Balkans were lost. This period is called the Latin Empire. Latin because the rulers came from Western Europe, but empire was just in name, really. A new Greek dynasty, the Palaiologos, managed to reclaim Constantinople in 1261 and revive Byzantine fortunes a little bit. But it was now too late. What remained of the empire had been ravaged by war, and Byzantium was surrounded with enemies. In the following decades in the 14th century, there were civil wars, and a new threatening dynasty emerged in Anatolia among the Turks, the Ottomans. Byzantium only controlled the region around Constantinople and a small territory in the south of Greece. The Ottomans completely circled it, passing from Anatolia to Europe and conquering much of the Balkans. The agony went on for decades, as Byzantium entirely relied on the goodwill of the Ottomans for their survival. Until 1453, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmet II decided to take Constantinople, which he did after a 2-month siege. At this point, the city had been taken multiple times already. It had lost much of its population, and the atmosphere in Constantinople, as the last remain of the Roman Empire, was about to fall. It must have been eerie, with these giant monuments from the past 1,000 years, palaces that were now too big for what remained on the courts and the army, a ghost harbor where no trade vessel could berth. According to witnesses, the last reigning Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, Palaiologos, was last seen throwing himself into hand-to-hand combat after the walls of the city were taken by the Turks. On 29 May 1453, an ambition that had started 2,000 years earlier in Italy and dominated the known world for centuries died definitively. The Roman Empire was now gone for good. The nephew of Constantine XI, Andreas Palaiologos, having inherited the title of Roman Emperor, went into exile in the south of Greece and then to Rome. The ones who would fulfill the dream of reconquering the early Byzantine Empire would finally be the Ottomans, because they did. They turned Constantinople into their capital. and in 2 centuries they built a new multicultural empire that resembled a lot of the early Eastern Roman Empire, except it was even larger. But what did not die with the fall of Constantinople was all the intellectual, artistic, and technical legacy of Byzantium. It had been passed to the Arabs already, to Western Europe, to the Turks, and this built a bridge between the Greco-Roman antiquity and modern times. For a part, the Italian Renaissance in the 15th century, just as Byzantium was falling, had been attributed to the migration of scholars and artists seeking refuge in Venice and the Papal States, Florence or Genoa. It is a matter of convention, but many historians take this date of 1453 as the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance. This is a choice that could be argued against, obviously, but symbolically, at least, it works. New, powerful kingdoms were set to dominate the next centuries. Now that the last one from antiquity had disappeared in this part of the world, new discoveries and an acceleration in technical progress were about to happen. And the Greek world, which had been so important since antiquity, had finally lost its last stronghold. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. And now you can let go and sleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.